Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Today we are talking about Wilhelm Reich. He was an Austrian doctor of medicine and a psychoanalyst. He was also the star pupil under Freud, but he was kicked out and ostracized when he began his work on the theory of orgone, which he advanced early in his life as a theory that people, human beings, gave off a particular sort of energy and accumulated a particular sort of energy when they were sexually excited. And after having sex, a human being would return to a lower level of this energy. He hypothesized that this was a physical energy that could be measured, and it existed everywhere in nature that there were living things. He felt so strongly that this energy was real that he set out to prove its existence after he was ostracized. So for the rest of his life, he went about systematically and scientifically proving the existence of orgone energy. The first thing he did was create something called the Orgone Accumulator. If you are looking for details on how to construct your own Orgone Accumulator, I recommend you refer to James DeMayo, PhD. His works on Orgone Energy are really, really good, and I'll link one of the PDFs of his books in the description, but I recommend you go and purchase them and support him. He also does lectures, which I've attended one of. He's a brilliant speaker. So Orgone Energy accumulators are basically apparatus where the energy which is present in the local environment, that is life force energy, or orgone, is concentrated inwardly and trapped inside this box. And in order to construct one of these boxes, you need cellutex, stainless steel, steel mesh, and wool. And basically, stainless steel, steel mesh, and wool compose of one single layer of orgone. And the more layers of that consecutively you have, the more effective it is. And the cellutex was on the outside. And all of these details are in James DeMayo's book. So once you've constructed an orgone accumulator, the energy inside of the accumulator causes a number of phenomena to exhibit themselves, such as the skin resistance of anyone who goes in it changes. The UV absorption of water, which has been sitting in the orgone accumulator, changes drastically. That was shown, that was proven rather by James DeMayo. And another thing that was proven by James DeMayo is that the temperature inside of this box is higher than the outside environment or a control box with a similar level of insulative material. And that is an interesting point to talk about because, you know, living creatures such as humans also have that temperature gradient from the inside to the outside of the body. And all orgone accumulators in nature have this. The Earth itself, in comparison to the vacuum of space, exhibits this temperature differential. So the ideal placement for an orgone accumulator, according to Wilhelm Reich and James DeMayo, is on the outside of a house, particularly remote from anything else, meaning it's not too close to a house, not too close to power lines, trees, or anything. It is ideally placed on top of a mountain or in a large valley, and a mountain being particularly effective. And the orgone accumulator works maximally when the weather outside is sunny. When there are clouds, what happens is the orgone energy, which naturally exists close to the Earth, becomes accumulated in the clouds, and the clouds are basically pockets of orgone energy which restrict the orgone energy in the atmosphere from descending to Earth. And it is interesting to note that when a cloud forms and it becomes more and more dense, like it is about to rain, the cloud becomes different shades of purple or blue, which is the shades of orgone as Wilhelm Reich discovered. Now, Wilhelm Reich placed many different things in his orgone accumulator to see what kind of effects were exhibited. And one of the more interesting experiments, which I'd like to talk about today, that Wilhelm Reich did with his orgone accumulators, is he placed an X-ray, I'm forgetting the name of it now, a device which measures the amount of radiation from X-rays or nuclear radiation, for instance. Inside of this device is the word is on the tip of my tongue. I can't seem to remember it. Inside of these radiation detecting devices is a special kind of tube. It is called a counter tube, and it helps the device to count the incidence of gamma and beta radiation coming into the apparatus. And it uses this as a detection method for telling people when they're too close to harmful radiation, such as X-ray or nuclear radiation. Once Wilhelm Reich placed this apparatus inside a Geiger counter, that is what it's called. Once Wilhelm Reich placed a Geiger counter inside of the Orgone Accumulator, it began to stop functioning. It no longer registered the incidence of radiation coming from outside. And so Wilhelm Reich, being an incredibly intuitive scientist, examined this, and he found that it was actually the vacuum inside this counter tube which was accumulating the Orgone energy. So he theorized that vacuums itself are a method of accumulating Orgone energy. It's one of the more ideal methods of transmission for Orgone energy, and he made his own vacuum tubes. His vacuum tubes consisted of a very large vacuous enclosure with a very high vacuum and 2 copper plates or other metal. And in between those 2 plates was a single thin tungsten wire. And he would charge 1 plate positive and 1 plate negative, but he wouldn't charge the tungsten wire. Instead, he attached the tungsten wire to a variety of things, such as an electroscope, which is a small leaf of gold foil that indicates electrostatic fields, and an amplifier, a standard amplifier. At the time he was doing it, I believe he was using vacuum tube amplifiers. So basically what he found is that coming off of this central tungsten wire, you would be able to read the ionization events that occurred between these 2 plates. And the plates, having a relatively low voltage, should not have had any ionization events occurring at all. And in fact, they didn't. When you got a tube fresh from the manufacturer, you weren't able to register any events happening. But after the tube was sitting in the Orgone Accumulator for long enough, you started to see interesting phenomena take place, such as a deflection of the electroscope. The gold foil would basically levitate. And you would also see pulse events of ionization happening between the 2 plates, and you could register these pulses especially well when you hooked it up to an amplifier. So at this point, I'd like to point out that tungsten is a very dense metal, and in the Russian research of Kozyrev and Akimov and others who studied torsion energy, they found that dense metals change their conductivity drastically in the presence of a torsion field. And that may or may not be related, but I feel that it is strongly, has a strong potential to be related to this phenomenon. So getting back to Wilhelm Reich, he constructed bigger and bigger tubes with bigger and bigger plates of metal with the tungsten wire in between always. And as he hooked it up to an amplifier, he was able to get real energy coming out of the amplifier in the form of a series of pulses. And he used these pulses to power things like the meter on the Geiger counter, and he also was able to power motors. Now, he never disclosed the design for these motors. He thought that the world was not ready for basically limitless energy coming from the Orgone field because they weren't even ready to listen to his theories on the Orgone energy field in the first place. So, in my opinion, he was using D'Arsonval type meters, and he removed the springs so that it was able to rotate freely. He may have used diodes and other smoothing techniques to get a more constant flow of energy into this type of motor. It's also possible, though, that he used an electrostatic motor. The only thing he says about the motor design was that it was of a special design, and he didn't disclose it any further. But he did talk about it in the same breath as the rotation of the Geiger counter meter, which is a D'Arsonval type meter. Anyways, real energy was coming from these plates, and all he had to do in order to get the energies going was charge these vacuum tubes of special design in his Orgone accumulators, and then from there he would bias the potential. So there would be, for instance, 800 volts, positive, negative, across these two plates, and that 800 volts was not being consumed. It was a static voltage, an electrostatic voltage, if you will. You could charge an 800 volt capacitor and just put it across those two plates, and the energy would not be consumed, at least not at the rate which the motor and amplifier provided energy. So in that sense, it was an open system. He was receiving energy from the environment. And so it was a rather miraculous set of experiments, and I will link to his experiments below. The implications of that experiment were that orgone is accumulated and most freely moves through a vacuum. So the vacuum of space around the Earth and through the universe is an example of something which is so incredibly dense with this orgone energy that it's difficult to comprehend. And this is perhaps where some of the misconceptions about dark matter come into play, because people think dark matter fills up most of the universe, when in fact orgone energy is the only force that we've really proven is in existence through Wilhelm Reich's work and is propagated through a vacuum very well. Orgone energy does not easily allow the passage of electromagnetic waves through it. It attenuates or completely demolishes the passage of electromagnetic waves, which is an example of why electromagnetic waves are not coherent with nature. They don't work well with nature. And it's also an example of something that may have caused scientists to get misconstrued with dark matter. And also, I want to speak about Victor Schauberger, who said that the vacuum accumulates very high essences of energy when there's a vacuum inside of a vortex. Now, in a previous video, I talked about how all spinning things emit torsion energies and subtle energies, but inside of the center of a very high rotational speed vortex, there is an intense vacuum. And this vacuum, according to Victor Schauberger, is charged with the highest grade life essences. And Victor Schauberger spoke about how there were ions that came from this energy source which produced high voltage and other effects, but they were not the ordinary ions that we see every day in nature. They were of a life-giving property. And Wilhelm Reich spoke about bions, an ion with a biological energy, which glowed blue. And his vacuum tubes also glowed blue in the presence of static electricity. And so all of these things start to become interrelatable. And we see a picture of great scientists like Victor Schauberger, Wilhelm Reich, Thomas Townsend Brown, with similarities in their work. Similarities between Thomas Townsend Brown and Reich are the tungsten 3-element capacitors, which Wilhelm Reich's vacuum tube is an example of something very similar to Thomas Townsend Brown's 3-element gravitator. And with Victor Schauberger, we see the vacuum concentrating a special form of energy. And so a little bit more on the bions before I close this video out. Wilhelm Reich, in his study of orgone energy, started his own laboratories and invited students to come study orgone energy with him. And one of the things that they found was that when certain things decayed, when there was a decay of matter, the matter would actually begin to turn into a blue pulsating substance, and it was ionic in nature. And this can actually be examined using certain techniques. James DeMayo talks about a technique where you put sand in a microwave, and you're able to actually see this decomposition into the bion state. And so that is an interesting thing that he talks about, and Victor Schauberger also talks about, the decay of a person when they're dead into a higher essence, a higher form, and that essence returns to nature and is an important part of the life process here on Earth. So, like Victor Schauberger, Wilhelm Reich was a very misunderstood and incredible man. He was way ahead of his time, and I really recommend that you read his work. I will link some of the things I talked about in this video below. I didn't have a chance to go over all of Wilhelm Reich's amazing discoveries in this video, but I wanted to give an overview of some of the things he did and discovered, and he was really, really amazing. And I really recommend that any of you who have access to an open space away from power lines, ideally in a valley or on top of a mountain, go and make your own Orgone Accumulator. James DeMayo's had amazing effects from his own Orgone Accumulators, even ones he's had in his garage in the city. It has less potency than one at the top of a mountain, but nevertheless works. And so thank you for watching, and you can feel free to check out some of the other videos on my channel about Orgone Energy and other amazing scientists. Thank you.